Hello and welcome to Eye on Oakland. I'm Chuck Moss, your host, and we've got a great guest. Actually, one of my favorite people to have on and have around is Mark Nickita. He's the president of Archive DS, urban planner, also a longtime city commissioner and mayor of the city of Birmingham. So we say you have practical urban planning experience and politics as well. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here once again.
Glad to have you. Excuse me. We call you Mr. Mayor. It's like Narnia. Once a mayor in Birmingham, always. So you're principal of Archive DS. What is that?
Archive Design Studio, and we thought that was a little long, so too many syllables and all that. So plus we want people to ask us. So you did just as expected.
We try. We endeavor to obviously please a guest.
So we consider ourselves a design studio, thinking more as a sort of a larger, view on things in problem solving and city building. So my partners and I were architects, urban designers, designers in general, entrepreneurs. We work with development, all kinds of different things. But ultimately, it's about city building. And so our group, our design studio, is focused on that.
And so you design cities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We don't obviously start cities from scratch because that's pretty rare. But we do enhance cities. That's our intention, is always to enhance the built environment wherever it happens to be. And for the most part, it's been in urban existing areas like Detroit, where I've worked, as you know, for many, many years, for decades actually, in the city of Detroit, and it's where our office is located downtown. But now one of the big areas that we're working is sprawl repair, or areas in suburban communities where sprawl or car-oriented development has been the focus since its inception, likely before or just after the war, post-war, World War II.
I was going to say, which war?
Yeah, the big one, as they say.
The big one.
WW2. So after that, the type of development was very commonly in many cities car-oriented and not so pedestrian-oriented. And now many of those communities are looking at ways to become more people-oriented, more place-oriented, and they need to sort of repair what they had created for many decades. And a lot of our work is actually oriented around what we consider sprawl repair, and that's a term that's commonly used around the country now. But that's an exciting area too, because we're making areas more urban, more walkable, more dense, more mixed use, in areas that typically haven't had those attributes.
Well, like you, I live in Birmingham, and one thing you notice if you go out 16 Mile is Troy, and Troy was the decentralized, low-density, car-oriented par excellence. And yet, if you go out there, you now are seeing lots of buildings along, and I don't know how walkable 16 Mile is, but nonetheless, you're seeing more of that. Those giant parking lots that were sort of like empty, wastelands for people are now being peopleized, if you will.
Repositioned, exactly. And Troy is one of the better examples, I think, of what we're talking about. They have, as a city, embraced the idea of repairing this sort of sprawl car-oriented development by changing their zoning that allows some of the things you just mentioned. Too many parking lots, too large parking lots, positioned parking lots along the street where people don't really want to walk because it's pretty boring to walk by a parking lot versus stores and businesses or what have you. And so their zoning advocates for that higher density kind of thing. And we're actually we've done some of those buildings along that you're mentioning. And we also are working currently on a couple projects in Troy, actually, as one of the examples of, where we're looking at this enhancement of the built environment that was a little bit more car-oriented and now will likely be not the case. Now, it won't be Birmingham, because Birmingham is a 200-year-old city built specifically without cars. Cars didn't exist, weren't even a consideration when it was built. So totally different built environment, what we call different bones. But the bones in these suburban areas can be enhanced. They can be brought to a stronger and a different position, and that's what we're doing. So it won't be recreating historic urban centers, but it'll be making it much, much better for pedestrians to be at and to live and work and play.
Well, it's funny. Back the days when we did the 2016 plan, and before that, the whole idea was that Birmingham was a failed suburb that ought to get with the program. And when we came to do that program, which you were involved in, of course, and so was I, is that it's a city. It's different. And I remember going in front of the Birmingham City Commission in those days, and I believe it might have been Coco Seward, and I was saying, that. Look, we have Birmingham and Troy. They're different animals, and they can each be each, and they can get rich together, like Birch Run and Frankenmuth. And she said, "Oh God, no!" I said, "No. Look, one's a mall and one's a city, and they get rich together. We don't have to compete with each other." And it's interesting to see Troy kind of, I hate to say repair because that assumes that they're bad. Where actually it's just progress or it's a development or whatever.
Right.
Now, it's interesting for you because you're not just a theoretician. You have a master's degree, maybe a doctor's degree in practical political theory, which means you were a politician and elected official.
Yeah.
Now, Detroit Renaissance, as we call it, the real Renaissance, is actually how old? What, 20 years old, 30 years old? You were the original maniacal optimist back in the 90s, when people even like me were writing for the news saying this place is a dead zone. How did you see the potential that was there and that it would change and happen? Because I sure didn't.
Well, maniacal optimist, I'll take it as a badge of honor, I suppose. But I guess I have attended, because I'm an architect, because I've been drawn to cities since I was a little boy going downtown with my mom.
Detroit is your hometown.
Detroit is my hometown. I grew up on the west side in Warrendale. I'm very, very engaged and connected to Detroit. But when I was a kid, we used to go downtown, and I just always recognized how distinctively different it was, how unique, how sort of special, in my opinion. And this is, of course, as the city was declining, I was seeing it in a light like, everywhere else I went, it was nothing like downtown. The buildings, the architecture, the towers, the vibrancy, the activity, even though it may have been diminishing as I was getting older and the city was getting more troubled, I still saw it as a differentiating, factor to all these other places. So I always saw that it was special. Architecturally, I always thought, wow, these buildings are quite amazing. I mean, there's like nothing else. Not only are they big and towers and all that, which I was attracted to, but just the uniqueness and the details and all that, I felt like this is too valuable to ignore. And then when I obviously went into architecture and became, went into architecture school, I started recognizing at a higher level and started traveling and started really seeing Detroit having this value that just wasn't going away. The value was still there. It just needed to be polished. And that was, I guess, my optimistic view on it. You can look at it, glass half full, glass half empty. And I always saw there was too much there to say that the glass is going to be tossed or should be tossed. It should be polished. It should be considered. And I was always waiting for the masses to sort of see that cities were the place to be. And we started seeing hints of that in the early 80s as you remember the big move toward festival marketplaces and these kinds of things.
Hart Plaza.
Yeah, I mean, there was all kinds of different things that were happening in the country. The Rouse Company in Quincy Market in Boston and places like that. And the rise of urban areas was starting to, sort of change the dynamic from decline to some level of recognition where the masses were kind of interested. And I thought, Detroit may be behind, but I think it's inevitably going to happen, and here we are.
Well, I was going to say, I got to Detroit in '76. I grew up in Midland, which is small, and to me it was like, Detroit was always like, it was like Paris or on some place. It was, that was where you and I went with my father to hockey games sometimes all the way down to Detroit. Yep. And by the time I got here, there were the towers, there was the city. It's like, wow, I've already made the big city, and I got there and. Yeah. There was something badly off about it, and it was just heading down. And it was just tragic to see all the lights go out. Mm-hmm. But to see it come back in, what do you think are the lessons of the Detroit comeback? And there's no doubt it's a comeback.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of people are looking at that because clearly Detroit is on the radar of a lot of people now that have written it off, and then they've recognized that that there's something here that's kind of special, a little bit unique, and just not the same as other cities that have transformed. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, you can get into the history of the cultural positives that have happened, the innovations that have happened here. I mean, you can go on and on about all the things that make Detroit special, and there is a lot to that. But I guess one of the things about what we did that other people, and it's sort of a negative became a positive. We had declined to such a degree that it wasn't worth tearing down buildings. It wasn't cost effective to just get rid of stuff. And a lot of cities actually were a little bit better positioned to have parking lots make sense, or older buildings were sort of antiquated and newer buildings were able to be built. And we really got to a point where those older buildings just sat and nobody saw a value to taking them out. So we ended up keeping a lot of them and letting them sit. And that was actually, believe it or not, a blessing in disguise, a value that ultimately came about later when we were starting to rethink, the city and rebuild it. We had all these structures to do something with. And these are a lot of the structures that I've worked on. I sort of cut my teeth at Archive DS. We were doing, 2, 4, 6, 8, 20 unit buildings in Midtown, on Willits and Cass, and back in the 90s when these buildings had been empty for decades, and we were resurrecting them into market rate housing because there was a need for that. And that was the sort of dawning of the market coming into, meaning the people's interest, the demand coming into the city, and proving that these old buildings are worth something. And that character today, all of those old buildings, and of course it went on and on for decades, now to the point where, the Book Tower, the Book Cadillac, now the train station, all have been renovated. Those are the big ones. But it started with all the little ones that actually were shown to be valuable. And people wanted them, and when they were done, renovated, people moved in, and it proved the market, and that justified moving forward. So these are the things that I think the little incremental changes were really valuable, and that was what Mayor Archer took a hold of. When he came in, he said, we're going to let the little developer have a value of high value, and we're going to work with them to, as with the big ones, because, the big ones are important too, but the little ones were really important. And
well, in Coleman Young's day, it was just, Coleman Young and Henry Ford and Leonard Woodcock, and the giants made over the heads, and all the little people ran away.
Yeah.
And that was what happened. And so it's
a big transition there with focusing on the little developer. Incremental development is critical to today's city building.
Incremental development. Not nuking things down with big projects.
Yeah.
Which means it's just, we're going to run out of time, but I'll just throw in my bugaboo, which is the Renaissance Center, which I've been down 3 times in the last 2 weeks. Guys, don't tear it down. It's fabulous. They shouldn't be afraid to shutter it for even 20 years. So the built environment, that's your incremental. Mm-hmm. So basically, we were so far down, we were so messed up that actually became it was frozen in time, and we were able to come back and use it.
It's a crazy blessing, but absolutely, that's one of the things that makes Detroit special today. It's the fact that we did not tear down so many great buildings when other cities did, frankly.
I think that's the lesson. It's funny. I remember going to something, and somebody was it was at a cocktail party, and this guy was throwing his weight around, and I said, I don't think so. And he says, well, so where are you from? I said, well, I'm from Detroit. And he said, I didn't really mean anything. Okay. Now it's like, wow, Detroit, you guys are cool. And I was like, geez,
no, we tore down plenty. Believe me, I'm not saying that we didn't tear down plenty, and that's unfortunate. But we had the opportunity, I think, to ultimately use a lot.
Save and reuse. Well, we're going to take a break here, and we'll be right back. We're talking with Mark Nickita, not only former Birmingham mayor and longtime commissioner, but the president of Archive DS, and one of the guys that, let's just be honest, has helped the Detroit Renaissance. Don't go away. We'll be right back here on Eye on Oakland. Welcome back to Eye on Oakland. I'm Chuck Moss, your host, and we're talking with Mark Nickita, who is the president of Archive Design Studio, or DS, also former Birmingham City Commissioner and mayor. So we were talking about Detroit, the Renaissance, the comeback, the true, which is undeniably happening. So I'm going to question is, so where do we go from here? I mean, downtown is looking great. Hopefully we can save the Renaissance Center, but where from here?
That's a good question. I think a lot of people don't think about, where we're going. They recognize that we've gone a long way to get from where we were many now decades, and how it had grown through the 90s and 2000, last couple of decades, to where we're at today. And cities are organic, so you don't want to plan or sort of guide it too rigidly, because I think it has to come through the process of, where the supply and demand and all the different things that guide it. And true cities that evolve properly, they actually have good guidelines and good governance, but ultimately they need to allow for the growth. And
the ideas of cities being organic and, first time I heard that was, believe it or not, from my father, as we were in downtown Lansing, driving toward East Lansing, and I'm looking at these old warehouses, and my dad said, "No, cities, they're not a snapshot.
They're always changing."
Yeah.
Well, good ones are. I mean, you can go to Venice. Venice isn't a real city; it's a museum, right?
Bad ones are also dynamic.
It depends on how dynamic you want to be. But I think that the reality is that we're seeing that embracing of the unique factor that is the city of Detroit, that how distinctive it is from pretty much anywhere. I mean, it is the most distinctive, unique place, especially the general core.
How so?
The city is big, but the core, and I mean not just downtown, the entire core and the areas that are peripheral, to that, like Corktown and to the east and a little to the north, and there's a lot of areas they're very, very different. The historical architecture, the density and the articulation of the plan, the way the street grids are, the pedestrian orientation of everything, the sort of
the bones,
the old history, the bones, if you will, are all part of that uniqueness. And then the things that are coming in, the investment of new development, are largely very unique as well. I mean, you have housing that's generally unique. You have adaptive reuse. You have historic buildings, industrial buildings that are being used for housing, for office, for retail, all these different things. There's a lack of sort of like the McDonald's with the drive-through. I mean, we have that in the city, but that's not the focus like it would be in a sort of suburban environment. The uniqueness is really interesting. As you know, because you take advantage of it as I do, the restaurants, the cultural assets, the symphony, all these different things are the core.
The opera.
And the opera, the art museums and such. These are the core sort of things that distinguish the city, the architecture, urbanism, and the culture, distinguish the city from anywhere else. And I think what I'm seeing is more and more people are really liking that. They want to be part of that, whether it's just to come in on a Saturday night and have dinner and go to an event, or they want to move there. A lot of the people that we live around in Birmingham, for example, have children that are moving downtown as they become adults. I mean, I have a son that's can't wait to move downtown at some point. He talks about, and he has friends that live there. So there's this embracing of younger people moving into the city and going for dinner. I mean, I just heard the other day, I was at the coffee shop in Birmingham, and I heard somebody say, I'm going downtown for dinner tonight. And it was right next to me sitting there. A couple was talking about it. And they said, "Oh, you're always going downtown for dinner." And I think this is the common thing, is that these are the things that we're seeing more and more of. So I think that's going to evolve. I think there's going to be more interest in people moving into the city, living in the city, playing in the city, if you will, whether it's events or what have you. There's obviously sports, there's music, there's art and culture, and then there's food, all part of these kinds of things. And then ultimately, we're going to have to see more and more accommodations for that. More housing, more places to work, more cultural and food and all that kind of thing. I think it'll continue to grow and become a stronger place. Cities like Toronto, which of course I know that I know quite well, is continuing to grow with more and more of these kinds of things, it can go. We have a long way to go before we're saturated, if you will. I think there's a lot of potential to grow.
Now, see, as far as I can see, the growth for the city of Detroit at this point, I want to say probably it's the crucial thing that needs to come in at the moment is schools, because your son, and young Mr. Hipster goes down and meets Miss Hipsterette, and they're living and they have a little hipsterling. Where is he going to go to school? They got to move back. We've heard this from people we know over and over again. They end up living in Clawson or someplace where they can find a little house and find a good school system. The Detroit public schools, frankly, are wretched and have been wretched for generations. Something's got to be done to keep the people in the city who have kids that need to be educated. And I don't know how you work with the Detroit public schools.
I would say that the Detroit circumstance is very similar to almost every American city. So I don't think it's a Detroit issue. I think it's an American urban issue. It's an American city issue. I hear this in Chicago all the time. People would say, I moved to Chicago. I love living there. I get married. I have a kid. When my kid turns 5, I move to the suburbs. I've heard that again and again and again. It's true in Cleveland. It's true in Boston. It's true in cities all over America. That's a much bigger and broader concern, that we could talk about it another time. But I think that having alternative options, continuing to grow the options for schools. I know where there's been successes is that when there's been alternatives, when there's been opportunities for certain schools to thrive in the places that where people really seek. But it's a very big challenge, and it's not a Detroit-only challenge by any means. It is an American urban challenge. It's a city after city after city after city concern, and it's not something that's specific to Detroit. So I think that exactly your scenario is true, but it's true in all these other cities.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I remember in the '60s, and my grandmother liked this poet by the name of Judith V. Orst, and I remember reading it, and it was about the suburbs, and it said over and over, the suburbs are good for the children, but they're no place for grown-ups to be because there's nothing to do. Because she was a New Yorker. But yeah, that's going to have to be addressed. I always thought Dan Gilbert or whatever the machine is now should use the charter school law to make its own school system like it made its own law enforcement community and just kind of go from there. But maybe that runs afoul of too many people in the city. I don't know. But yeah,
it's very challenging, obviously, financially, politically. I mean, there's a lot of things that have to be addressed, and it's not an easy
Take that
answer.
out, the floodgates will open. But here's a question now. You were talking before we talked about North Woodward or the North Woodward. I hate to say this, but I'm gonna. Is that back in the '90s, I was writing about Woodward Avenue from Ferndale to up to Square Lake-ish as the downtown Metro Detroit is kind of the spine there. Well, now we have a downtown again. What's going on with that sort of North Woodward, whatever we're going to call it?
Yeah. I've loosely been using the term Norwood or Norwood or North Woodward. I've done a lot of work on.
And we're not talking about North Woodward in Birmingham.
No, North Woodward as part of Woodward Avenue, which is is a 27-mile thoroughfare, M1. It's a Michigan street, and it goes from the river all the way to Pontiac, and it's 27 miles roughly. So I've studied this a lot. I've done work along Woodward right from the very beginning, all the way, meaning all the way downtown, all the way to Pontiac. And all the way through in between, I've done corridor studies and a number of different urban design plans. So I know it very, very well. I've studied extensively. I really believe, in a city, in a state like Michigan, 10 million people, there's thousands and millions and thousands of roads, and miles of roads, and what have you. I believe Woodward Avenue is the most important street in all of the state of Michigan.
No argument from me.
I don't think you can argue that without trouble.
Now you do know that Woodward Avenue is a very long street, and it actually technically goes all the way
Saginaw Trail,
through Saginaw, through Flint, through Midland, my hometown, and out and yeah. So,
but technically Woodward is just the 27 miles.
I grew up cruising Woodward, just really, 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 really far north on Saginaw and Midland.
So I think to answer your question, I believe it's a very, very, and the reason why I say it's so important is all of the assets that are along it are quite amazing. I mean, from cultural to educational.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go on and on about all the things that are there.
Well, Ferndale is great, but south of Ferndale, you've got the 8 mile wall as it goes over.
The bridge is terrible.
How are you gonna? How do we integrate that bit in? Oh, and Pontiac. Can Pontiac? I mean, you think turning Pontiac around would be easier than turning Detroit around?
Working in Pontiac now too, right?
Get
now.
out of here!
And I've worked in Pontiac for years actually, probably about 15, 20 projects
Get out
over
of
the
here.
years. But we're working right now in Pontiac to enhance that. So my thinking is that Woodward is this 27 miles. Of course, there's a lot of things that go on along the way. The downtown core is now strengthening more and more. And really, it's a great corridor from the river all the way to about where the cathedral is, which is Boston Edison,
yes.
The Sacred Heart Cathedral.
North of that, I'd call it a dead zone.
Yeah, north of that, it starts to break down. Of course, you have Highland Park and other things going on. And then it picks up again around Palmer Park. In the Detroit Club and the golf club and these kinds of things. So there's a really strong 3.5, 4 miles downtown, which is the core in the downtown core. So that's the downtown sort of greater downtown area. But north, I think there's a real value to what I would consider to be North Woodward or Norwood, which is this area from roughly 8 mile or even 7 mile with the Palmer Park and all to about Birmingham. Because it breaks down after that because of there's no activity along the street.
No, it's nice. Yeah. It's
not commercial. There's no real assets until you get to in terms of commercial assets or destinations until you get to Pontiac essentially.
Right.
But that area from Birmingham to Royal Oak, to 8 Mile roughly, you have many assets all within this couple of mile strip, which are quite amazing. Historical assets. Places that are growing and doing well, have a lot of cultural, housing, even office type of environments. Downtown Ferndale, strengthening all the time. Downtown Royal Oak, getting better. There's new public space there. There's new investment, all kinds of different things. And then you have the developing downtown Berkeley. You have an enhanced Clawson that's starting to really come about.
It kind of like water. It kind of squirted out both ways.
It's amazing, yeah. And I think Clawson's doing a great job enhancing itself, and it's being part of this network. And then, of course, the crown jewel at the north end is Birmingham,
as we would expect.
As we know, it's the best small town, and arguably the best small town or suburb in America.
Well, no argument for me.
And I think it's an amazing sort of northern endpoint to that grouping. So if you live in this corridor of a few miles, there's all these different assets that not only are great on their own, but they work together, and you're part of them all. And it's along the spine of the Woodward Avenue. So I think that should be solidified, strengthened, enhanced, and considered a unit. Not considered, 5 or 6 different communities, but considered one great asset. And that you live or work in this area, it's a great place to be. And that's right down the street from downtown, which is a great asset. So being in this environment, I think, is a great positive.
Well, it's got to have been great to have been on the right side of history, even when everybody said you were nuts, including me. And now
I do remember those days.
I'm not going to say I was wrong. I'm going to say I was right, considering the shall we say, facts and conditions on the ground. I'm very happy to have seen them turn around and to be proven wrong. Anyway, it's been great talking to Mark Nickita, who, by the way, you guys own Pure Detroit, don't you?
Yeah, that's my partners and I are the creators and still run Pure Detroit. Yeah.
Well, that's our go-to for Christmas Christmas stuff anyway. So
PureDetroit.com.
PureDetroit.com. We can put that up. Mark Nickita, who is the president of Archive Design Studio, or DS, also a longtime commissioner, mayor of Birmingham. Bullish on Detroit as always, and it's really hard to deny. I'm Chuck Moss, and thank you for joining us here on Eye on Oakland.